Hello, this is Dr. Swanberg. I'm going to talk to you today about complex sentences. A complex sentence is an independent clause or a simple sentence that has a subject, a verb, and independent meaning with a dependent clause attached. Remember, a dependent clause is one that has a subject and a verb but does not make sense alone. It must be attached to an independent clause or it will be a fragment. Dependent clauses can be placed at the beginning, in the middle, or at the end of an independent clause to create a complex sentence. There are three ways to form a complex sentence: with an introductory clause attached to an independent clause, with an interrupting dependent clause attached in the middle of an independent clause, and with a concluding clause that follows an independent clause. So there are three places you can place the dependent clause: before an independent clause, in the middle of an independent clause, or after an independent clause. All forms of complex sentences need connections. Commas connect and subordinating conjunctions connect. One of the reasons we have so many fragments is that students will begin a sentence with a subordinating conjunction, or a connecting word, and then never connect it to anything. They'll either leave it as a fragment, or they'll forget to put the comma in at the end of the dependent clause. Here are some subordinating conjunctions and connecting phrases. One of the things to realize is that if you begin a sentence with one of these words or phrases, the chances are very high that you have a complex sentence, and it needs to be connected to an independent clause by a comma. Let's look at a complex sentence with an introductory clause. When you begin a complex sentence with an introductory clause, use a comma to connect the dependent clause to the independent clause. Place the comma at the end of the whole dependent clause, not after the connecting word itself. Let's look at some examples. After it rained, there was a rainbow. After is the connecting word or subordinating conjunction. It also has a subject and a verb. It rained in the dependent clause at the beginning. But if you say after it rained all by itself, it doesn't make sense. You're waiting for the rest of the sentence. There was a rainbow is an independent clause that you can say by itself. Rainbow is the subject and was is the verb, and you understand what I'm saying when you say there was a rainbow. So we have at the beginning, after it rained, a dependent clause followed by a comma and then an independent clause, there was a rainbow. Let's look at the other examples here. When I was 7, I was stung by a bee. Again, the subordinating conjunction at the beginning of the sentence, when I was 7, means that the subject and the verb, I was in I was 7, no longer makes sense by itself. You have promised with the word when to connect it to something else. The comma is that connection. It is connected to the independent clause, I was stung by a bee, which can be said by itself. Let's look at our third example. Even though he loves math, it is hard for him. Please keep in mind that a dependent clause can actually be longer than the independent clause in a sentence. Although I dislike onions, I love onion rings. If you look under the bed, you will find toys. In all of these examples, it's the subordinating conjunction at the beginning of the dependent clause that makes it a dependent clause. Without it, you would have two independent clauses. Let's look at a complex sentence with an interrupting clause. Sometimes we can interrupt a sentence, just like we are interrupting this one, with an interrupting clause. The interruption should be placed after the word it is going to tell more about, like sentence in the previous case. Sometimes the clause is between the subject and the verb. The clause needs a comma on both sides of the interruption. Make sure you have a complete and correct sentence surrounding the interruption. Let's look at some examples. Here, the independent clause is, my mother is a very good listener. It is interrupted by the phrase, who teaches 4th grade. Who serves as our subject pronoun, and teaches is our verb, but this doesn't make sense by itself. Who teaches 4th grade cannot stand alone, so we put it in the middle of the sentence to further modify mother. My mother, who teaches 4th grade, is a very good listener. Let's look at our second example. The independent clause is, the first thing to do is to research successful businesses like the one you want to own. In the interrupting clause, we do have the subordinating conjunction if, but we still need a comma here to connect it, because it is an interrupting clause. The first comma indicates that we are about to experience an interruption. The first thing to do, if you want to succeed in starting your own business, is to research successful businesses like the one you want to own. The clause, if you want to succeed in starting your own business, has a subject and a verb, you and want, but it does not make sense by itself. If I simply said, if you want to succeed in starting your own business, that wouldn't make any sense by itself. So here we've connected it. We've connected it in the middle of an independent clause. Let's look at our last example. Jane, who is stubborn as a mule, never admits defeat. The independent clause is Jane never admits defeat. That makes sense all by itself. The dependent clause, who is stubborn as a mule, has the subject who and the verb is, but it does not make sense by itself. Here we have it interrupting the sentence to tell us more about Jane. Here are some more examples, simply because these are difficult. My aunt, the woman who raised me, is a very religious woman. The dinner, which sat on the table while the family argued, was cold and unappetizing. The parents of the young soldier, who were overjoyed to see him again, had tears of happiness and gratitude in their eyes. Again, on this, you can see that the independent clause in white stands alone as its own independent clause or its own simple sentence. The clauses in yellow or orange are the dependent clauses which interrupt that independent clause. They have subject and verb, but they cannot stand by themselves and make sense. We have to connect them to the rest of the sentence with commas. Let's take a look at complex sentences with the dependent clause at the end. Sometimes we want to add a little bit more to our sentences we want to extend. Use a comma before attaching the concluding phrase to attach it, as we've done in this sentence. Let's look at some examples of complex sentences with concluding phrases that use commas. I gave her a prom dress to wear, one that was too small for me. Again, we have an initial independent clause, I gave her a prom dress to wear, that could go by itself, but we wanted to add a little bit more information to it, and we said, one that was too small for me. One that was too small for me cannot go by itself. It has one and was, subject and verb, but it doesn't make sense alone. So we add it to the independent clause with a comma. My dog ate my shoes last night, comma, the pair I loved the most. Again, the dependent clause at the end, the pair I love the most, has I and loved, subject and verb, but it doesn't make sense alone. If I said the pair I loved the most all by itself, you'd have no idea what I was talking about. So we have connected it with a comma to the independent clause, my dog ate my shoes last night. Our last example shows us the fourth grader's homework took 5 hours to complete, which seems excessive. Again, the clause, which seems excessive, has a subject, which, and verb, seems, but it doesn't make sense all by itself. It is tempting to put this by itself because it seems like a new thought, but it's not a thought that can stand by itself, so it has to be connected with the complete thought that went before it. The fourth grader's homework took 5 hours to complete, comma, which seems excessive. That's the end of our presentation on complex sentences. If you need to review it, back the presentation up and watch it again.